Hello and welcome to this video on the British sector of the Western Front, which is the case study needed for Edexcel's Medicine Through Time GCSE history paper. I do apologise that it's been a while since I've last uploaded, but there are going to be some videos coming very soon. So let's get straight into it. So if you want to pause the video, there's some starter questions there just to test your knowledge, some kind of general questions about World War One, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what we're going to do in today's video. Okay, so today's video, we're going to start by, the majority of the video will be focusing on the key content. I will then talk about how you should approach each question in section A of this paper. So there's some key structures and strategies I wanted to go over. I will be doing a separate video on exam technique at some point for that, but in the meantime, this will give you the key structures and strategies you need. And then I've also attached some resources in the description of the video. So a model answer released by Edexcel themselves, and then also a revision pack. So a very useful revision guide that I've found online. So before we even jump into the content, there's a note-taking sheet that is also found below. So spend the next 3 minutes, pause the video, and try and see how much of that you can complete before we go through the content. Okay, so the way kind of Edexcel have divided this topic is there's a hefty section focused on problems associated with trench conditions. So the first problem we need to look at is trench foot. So trench foot, very simply, is caused by standing in waterlogged trenches. So when there's too much water in the trench, from rain, of course, and the result of that is the foot becomes infected. So our key term there is gangrene, and that can eventually lead to a loss of limbs, especially if the infection spreads. Now, the reason why that's significant is it will mean that less soldiers are available to fight. Okay, because if they're having to have treatment on that leg, then they're not going to be able to take part in the fighting. So there are some solutions which Britain develops to deal with trench foot as this becomes a more significant problem. So to prevent the impact of trench foot, medical officers would order soldiers to always have on them multiple pairs of socks, to change those socks regularly. They're also encouraged to rub whale oil into their feet as well, as a mechanism to kind of guard against this. And there were attempts to reduce the waterlogging in the trenches and to add duck boards. Now, duck boards are essentially wooden panels which will go along the bottom of a trench. And famously, the German trenches had the German trenches were very, very advanced compared to the British trenches, which were lagging behind. Okay, so that's trench foot. The second condition associated with the trenches that you need to be aware of is trench fever. That's spread by lice, so it's completely different to trench foot, and it would present as kind of flu-like symptoms. Men could be ill for up to a month at a time, which again would take them out of the action. And that's a problem if you're in the middle of a war and you've got thousands of soldiers experiencing trench fever. So the solutions is delousing stations were set up on the front. So there were stations where, kind of in sterile conditions, where men would have the lice removed. Clothes were disinfected, and then men were bathed and sprayed with chemicals to prevent lice. Okay, so they do deal with that relatively effectively. But it is an ongoing issue throughout World War One. Okay, our third problem that you need to be aware of is shell shock. Now, that's more commonly known as kind of PTSD. That's how we would refer to it in the modern day. And that's the constant shelling, the constant use of explosives detonating on the front line would lead to men suffering from this condition. Now, shell shock's an interesting one because it is a mental condition. All right, a mental condition though which had physical symptoms. So the men who experienced shell shock would report that often that they were suffering from tiredness, headaches, nightmares, loss of speech, and then the famous symptoms are uncontrollable shaking and complete mental breakdowns. A lot of them will talk about having flashbacks, imagining that they're back kind of in the middle of the action on the front line. So that is a symptom to be aware of for shell shock. And it's estimated that 80,000 British troops experienced shell shock during World War One. Those are based upon kind of reports from the time. So obviously we can infer or work from that probably quite a few more also experienced it as well. So the key solutions is that there's nothing initially. It's viewed with skepticism by generals in the army. The idea that these men should just man up and deal with it. And then towards the end of the war, Craig Lockhart Hospital is created and set up, and in particular they specialise in dealing with mental health, and it's one of the first medical institutions in Britain that's focused on mental health. All right, it's located in Scotland, and very famously, you probably will have heard of this in your English lessons. A man called Wilfred Owen was discharged there on grounds of shell shock. Okay, your fourth problem is gas attacks. So gas caused great panic as soldiers were unprepared for it. It wasn't a major cause of death though, so only 6,000 soldiers died during World War I as a result of gas attack. For the exam, I would recommend that you know the following three gases. So we've got chlorine, phosgene and mustard gas. So I'll leave that screenshot up on the screen if you want to pause it and make some notes about those. I would be aware of some of the evidence that I've included there, which is again just a snippet from this excellent textbook I found online, which will be linked below. The key thing to be aware of though is that the solution to gas attacks was for soldiers to be given gas masks, and from July 1915, gas masks started to be rolled out, and over time, as kind of all soldiers were given gas masks, the threat posed by gas was kind of reduced massively. All right, so gas is not really a massive issue. With gas though, we can kind of link it into psychological issues. So it might not necessarily lead to death, but the fact that the odorless gases, gases which are sometimes invisible as well, could have such effects on people and lead to them feeling like they're suffocating and drowning. You can imagine the kind of damaging psychological impact that might have. The final problem that I've kind of put down, which is again I've kind of taken a screenshot from that textbook just because it summarises it better than I can possibly hope to do, is the practical problems associated with trench conditions. So at the start of the war, Britain was using horse-drawn ambulance wagons to kind of reach men who were injured on the front line. Now, as you can imagine, in muddy conditions, whilst there's guns firing off, having a horse drawing is not going to be very helpful. So towards the end of the war, they start to use motorised ambulances, and there's kind of like a fundraiser, and 512 ambulances are rolled out. So that's really, really significant. And that's something which starts off in 1914, but they become kind of more and more apparent on the battlefield. There's also as well, they also make use of train, barge and ship ambulances as well, to get men who are injured away from the front line. Okay, so before we move on to look at the chain of evacuation, I just wanted to make you aware of some of the kind of other key important information and developments to be aware of. So first of all, I will go into these a little bit later, but you just need to be aware of some of this information now. So first of all is the first X-ray was invented in 1896, and that's used on the Western Front in vehicles to identify broken bones. The limitations, though, of these X-ray machines was that they use 1,500 times the amount of radiation that current X-rays use. So obviously you can imagine the damaging side effects of that amount of radiation, or potential side effects I should say, and that they take 90 minutes to complete. So on a battlefield, having 90 minutes is a hell of a long time. So that is a big limitation, which meant that which limited the effectiveness of these X-rays. Blood transfusions became very important in World War I, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The key thing you need to be aware of now is that they were discovered by a man called, blood groups were discovered by a man called Karl Landsteiner in 1901, and because he knew the different blood types that people might have, so A, B or AB, he then basically was able to work out how blood transfusions could happen. I'm not going to go into it massively because I'm not a science teacher, but essentially some blood types can only donate to other blood types. So being aware of those groups makes transfusions, makes them possible. The issue with that though is that doctors hadn't worked out how to store blood at this moment in time. So patients and donors had to be physically connected to kind of do a blood transfusion. So on the battlefield, the person donating blood had to be connected via a tube to the person receiving blood. Okay, which, as you can imagine, is very, very difficult to do in the middle of a war. And then finally, aseptic surgery is very important. So you will have seen in my previous video on the Enlightenment, we talked about antiseptic surgery. Aseptic surgery is kind of antiseptic surgery, but the next evolutionary step. So instead of just applying antiseptic to the wound, aseptic surgery is where all medical equipment and the room itself is sterilized. Okay, so that will often involve kind of spraying antiseptic throughout the room, and what that means is that again it vastly reduces the chances of infection. So it's very, very effective, and obviously the issue is it practical in trench conditions when you're trying to treat men, sometimes on the battlefield or just off the battlefield in a regimental aid post. Is it possible to do aseptic surgery? Definitely not. But nonetheless, it's a significant medical development that you need to be aware of for this part of the course. Okay, so now we're on to the chain of evacuation, and this is basically kind of explores the experiences of injured soldiers, and we kind of will look at where they would go based upon their injury. So the first thing you want to be kind of being aware of is the RAP, so the Regimental Aid Post. So that's located within about 200 meters of the front line in what is known as a communication trench. So the front line is the first trench in opposition to the enemy. You then have a support trench, and then you have the communication trench. And that is the purpose of the Regimental Aid Post, is to give immediate first aid and to get as many men back to the front as quickly as possible. The Regimental Aid Post does not deal with serious injuries. Okay. The second chain, or the second kind of link in the chain of evacuation, are dressing stations, so known as the advanced dressing station and the main dressing station. And those are usually pretty close still to the front line, but they can look after more men. They have more medical officers, and they can deal with about 150 men. And the conditions that they're dealing with are slightly more serious than the kind of injuries that the Regimental Aid Post deals with, but still they're not massively serious. And you know, in some crunch points, so in the Battle of Ypres, they dealt with 1,000 casualties in 2 days. Okay, third point that you need to be aware of is the casualty clearing stations. These are probably the most important, as the exam board like to give you sources which are from casualty clearing station records. These were about 7 miles away from the front. They had multiple doctors again. This time they have operating theatres, and that's how they're different from the advanced dressing station. And they had x-ray machines and wards, and they could deal with up to 1,000 casualties at a time. In some cases they could go even more than that. And they treat the most critical injuries near the front. All right, and they operate on something called a triage system. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail here, but it's worth, especially if you're targeting the higher grades, just worth googling that and being aware of what that is. And then finally, base hospitals is the fourth point in the chain of evacuation. Those are situated near the coasts for the swift medical evacuation of the soldier to Britain if necessary. So to reach those, often men would be transported, as we've seen, you know, from the kind of RAMC trains a few slides ago. They'd be transported to the coast, to the base hospital, and then worst case they could be then sent back to Britain. Base hospitals again had operating theatres, x-ray machines, so they have even more specialist medical equipment, and they had specialist centres as well. So that's how they're different. So they can treat gas poisoning and head wounds, for example, and they could treat up to 2,500 patients at once. So base hospital is very similar to what we would understand a hospital to be. In terms of the kind of some of the new techniques in the treatment of wounds, there's quite a few that you need to be aware of, but not in a huge amount of detail. So amputation, quite self-explanatory, where a limb is chopped off. 240,000 men were recorded to have experienced this, and that's just amputation in relation to infection. Then there's something known as a wound excision. So that is where the dead flesh around the wound is kind of cut away, and the bullet fragments are removed. Again, they had been practicing that before World War One. It becomes a more effective technique during the war. And then the Kautokeino method, where antiseptic was antiseptics such as carbolic lotion were inefficient sometimes with treating gangrene. So the Kautokeino method is kind of there to replace that. So it's where they'd put a sterilized salt solution and that would be fed into the wound through a tube, and that led to lower rates of infection. All right, so it's a more successful way of dealing with infection than antiseptic. You definitely need to be aware of the Thomas splint. So if your leg was broken, obviously the bones are then overlapping or crisscrossing. The Thomas splint pulls the bones back into their original position and holds it there. So if you've ever broken your leg, if you have a cast put on, that's basically very similar to a Thomas splint. It works in the same kind of way. The only difference is that the Thomas splint, the men would have to be staying kind of lying down until their legs had mended. The mobile X-rays. So 6 mobile vans were used on the Western Front, or on the British sector of the Western Front, to identify breaks. So they kind of would go around and identify where men had broken their bones, which can then lead to more targeted treatment and surgery. Blood transfusions. So this is probably the most important thing. So Geoffrey Keynes in 1917 designed a portable transfusion kit, allowing transfusions to be done closer to the front lines. And the key thing as well is that the British developed something known as a blood bank. So that's based upon the fact that in 1915 it was found that by adding sodium citrate to blood, that stopped it from clotting. And that's a really important thing. So that means that blood can be stored. And because blood can be stored, it can then be, you can see there as well, the development in 1916, it can now be refrigerated. And what that means is now that blood can be stored and refrigerated, is that a blood bank can then be created. And that's basically where there'll be hundreds of pouches of blood donated. And that blood would then be used in the case of a battle. So in this case, in the Battle of Cambrai in 1917, they have the blood bank ready and waiting, so that when men experience injuries on the front or during the battle, they can then get that donation straight away. So it means that not only are more lives going to be saved, but it's also a lot less risky as well. So instead of a man having to be connected with, so instead of the donor having to be connected with the person receiving the blood, they can instead, the medical officers can just directly transfuse the blood from a pouch. Okay. What we're going to do now is we're just going to have a think about how do we approach the questions on section A. So section A of your paper. So the first question you get is your describe two features questions. By this point you should know how to answer that, I would say. If not, if you want to need a quick recap, essentially you just need to talk about two separate features, so they have to be separate, and it needs to be supported with relevant specific details. Essentially, I always tell students, if you've done your revision, you'll get the marks on that. If you haven't done your revision, you won't get the marks on that question. So if you can tell me two things about most of the topics on any part of the medicine paper, you should be okay for that question. The second question is how useful are two sources. So say how useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into. For that, there's many different structures you can try. So in some schools they use the 4 C's. The structure that we are teaching you is to use COPE. So first of all, you're going to start by picking out what you can see in the source. So if it's an image, identify what you can see and how that's relevant for the question. If it's a passage, select a quotation and say how that is relevant for the question. Okay, so don't just say in the source it says this without actually telling me or giving me a quote. Okay, so actually use speech marks for that. The key thing, what I mean by when I say how that is relevant, you have to make sure that you're addressing the questions. You need to be saying, is that useful? All right, constantly be linking back to, is that useful? The second thing you then need to do is you then need to include your own knowledge. And you need to say whether the source matches up with your own knowledge or doesn't match. If it does match, it's useful. If it doesn't, not that useful. Now, most of the time, in nearly all exams I've seen, nearly all the past papers I've seen, the sources that they give are pretty useful when answering the question. So If you're saying it doesn't match up with your own knowledge, you might need to have another look at the source, because it probably does. Because it's very rare that they'll give you a source which is not useful at all. The third part is provenance. So this is what's going to kind of set your answer apart. So you need to think about the nature, origin, or purpose of the source, and link that back to whether the source is useful. So when we're saying nature, we're talking about the type of source. Is it a diary entry, for example? Is it a photo taken by a journalist? Okay. Then you think about the origin. So who created the source? When? What was the context at that time? Was it part of a specific battle? Does it come from an RAMC medical record? Think about that and how that's going to affect how reliable and useful the source is. And then for purpose, you need to think about what's the intention behind the person who's created the source. So if it's a medical record, and then the intention there is just to obviously have information about the patient. But if it's a speech given by someone, then perhaps the intention behind that is not necessarily to educate or to kind of neutrally record information, but rather to convince people of a certain way of thinking. Okay, so if it's a speech, you might want to say it's maybe not as reliable, but obviously that would depend on the source. And then finally, when you've done your C, O, and P, so your content, own knowledge, and provenance, you then need to evaluate. So the question is saying how useful are sources A and B. You need to say whether the source is useful or not. Try to use phrases like partly useful or extremely useful. Don't use phrases like it's useful or it's not useful. That's very basic. It's not very sophisticated. So essentially, to wrap up for that question, you need to do one paragraph on source A, one paragraph on source B. Okay. You can do a conclusion if you would like to, but it's not necessary, and you definitely don't need to compare the sources. So a lot of candidates try and compare the sources. That is not going to get you any extra marks. So it's really not worth your time. Okay. Focus on each source individually, and then come to a conclusion for each one individually, saying whether it's useful or not. All right. And again, using those phrases like partly useful or extremely useful. And the final question on section A is a source follow-up question. So it looks a little bit like this. So it says, how could you follow up source A? And this one says to find out more about the effects of a gas attack. Now your first two questions on that, so the detail in source A that would follow up and question I would ask, those two questions are linked. Okay, so you will need to you need to make sure that your kind of content that you've included there is linked to one another. So for the detail in source A that you would follow up, you need to make sure you give a quote. Okay, that you give a quote. So don't just be vague, or don't put your question there. You have to give a quote from the source, and that quote needs to be relevant to the effects of a gas attack. All right. The question that you would ask then needs to be directly linked to the question. So this question, as I've already said, is talking about the effects of a gas attack. You need to make sure that your question is about the effects of a gas attack. Okay. The question, though, should be relevant to the detail that you've picked out in the source. Okay. So you've got to be imagine that you're a kind of a historian and you're asking a question to the person who's created the source. What would you ask about the effects of a gas attack? All right. So those first two questions are linked. If you don't do the first bit right, so if you don't do detail and source A, then you can't get the second mark. All right. So you can very easily lose a lot of marks on this question. For when it says what type of source I could use, for that section or for that part of this question, you want to be talking about the RAMC medical records or casualty clearance station records, something like that. All right. Don't say that you could use the other source that they give you. Don't just say a diary entry or a photo from the time. That's not specific enough. You need to give a specific source. If you were struggling, I would put down RAMC medical records, because for nearly every year that has been an acceptable answer. All right. So RAMC medical records. And then the final question is saying how that source that you could use, which you've already mentioned, so in this case the RAMC medical records, how is that going to help you answer your question, so the question that you've posed. All right, and that's just a very simple, this source would help me understand, because the RAMC medical records provide detailed information about patients who have suffered from gas attacks, and therefore I could understand more about certain effects, something like that. And that way you're linking back to the original question, and you're going to pick up all the marks. Again, I will do a more detailed video on exam technique, not only for this part, but for all of the different papers in Edexcel GCSE history, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, I thought I'd just give you that advice, because this does account for a significant chunk of your medicine through time marks, this part of the paper, and it's often the section that students really struggle with. So definitely use that. Last thing from me as well is to just a reminder that the content that we cover is probably what you need to get up to grade 6, grade 7. To get those higher grades, you will need to be kind of reading around what I've already kind of given you and the resources that I've attached below. So you probably want to be either get yourself a medicine through time textbook, or the best place is to watch other YouTube videos from other teachers, but also documentaries as well about the period. Try and just expand your knowledge as much as you can, and that will help you out very much for the exam. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers. And then the final bit for kind of new techniques in the treatment of wounds, and the final bit for this content section is surgery. And again, I've just taken a screenshot from that textbook because it's very, very helpful. So 20% of all injuries in World War I were to the head or face, and there's two men who pioneered two types of surgeries that you need to be aware of. So for brain surgery, you need to be aware of a man called Harvey Cushing, and he basically develops kind of new forms of surgery to deal with the removal of metal fragments, so pieces of shrapnel, in some cases bullets as well. So the way he would do that is he would use a local anaesthetic instead of a general anaesthetic, and that reduced the chances of brain swelling, and he had a very, very high success rate. So his success rate was 71% compared to the usual kind of success rate or survival rate, I should say, of 50%. All right, so he does pioneer that. And then in terms of plastic surgery, so if part of a man's face was blown off, they would need what is known as a skin graft, and that's a new form of surgery pioneered by a man called Harold Gillies. So you'd often take that from a person's back, or taken from kind of a loose skin on another part of the body, and that would be grafted onto the face. So as you can see, that man in the bottom right hand corner, that is the same man. So the first time, or in the first picture, sorry, you can see that he's had a very devastating gunshot wound. They've then taken some skin from his rib, and then have kind of grafted that onto his face. And he's also applied a tube so that there is blood reaching that part or that skin that he's added. And this is a very, very important form of surgery, and is pioneered during World War I, and it now leads to kind of what we would now call as facial reconstructive surgery. Okay, so